Hey y'all, Austin here with Outer World Media. Welcome back to another book review. Before I get into the review, I just have one question for you. Kind of a challenge, if you will. I want to ask you, I want you to tell me someone who gets more pleasure out of being thrown 30 feet in the air, more ecstasy from getting hit with steel chairs that are lit on fire, more just pure enjoyment out of flying in the air and getting hit with kendo sticks, getting thrown on thumbtacks, getting, their eighth concussion, within a year, more pleasure and pain and all that than my man, Mick Foley here. Yes, I am reviewing the awesome novel that is Have a Nice Day by Mick Foley, aka Dude Love, aka Mankind, aka Cactus Motherfucking Jack. Yes, I do apologize for cussing, but you can't say Cactus Jack and not cuss. I'm sorry, you just can't. Kids, if you're wanting to watch this review, go away. This is not gonna be for you. So we're gonna do a review on this in kind of like four different sections. His growing up kind of age, his indies, his WCW, and his WWE days, and then just kind of sum it all up and whatnot. So we're gonna get into it. Before we get into that, though, I want to start off the first chapter of this book is talking about him versus Vader over in Germany and him losing his ear and how it comes off. And it was a very, very unique way to start off a book because it just captures your attention and makes you think, holy crap, we are in for a world of hurt, hearing what he has gone through. And I remember in school, when we had to write a story or something, the teacher used to say, that first chapter, that first paragraph needs to capture your audience's attention. And I think Mr. Foley here paid more attention in English than I did because holy crap, did he capture my attention. Now, that's not to say this book is all blood and guts. For the first about 150, almost 200 pages, it's really just talking about him growing up. His parents were teachers. He talks about, how his dad was athletic coach or director or whatever of the year for the whole nation or state or something like that. He talks about how he had a very normal childhood. The way he grew up, you wouldn't think that he would have became a wrestler. He talks about how, he was in sports. He wasn't the best in sports. He really liked lacrosse because it's kind of like it's a team sport, but you can do stuff by yourself and whatnot. And so he talks about, being in sports and whatnot and how he was in the off season just kind of conditioning for lacrosse and whatnot. And a buddy of his says, hey man, what are you doing? You're in track. No offense, you're kind of slow. Why don't you come do, wrestling? He's like, well, Kevin James, yes, the King of Queens, Kevin James, went to school with Mick Foley. I don't know about you, but I would love to have gone to that school with Mick Foley being there and Kevin James at the same time. I think that definitely would have been a very comedic senior class. But he talks about, how Kevin James kind of had it pigeonholed there, and they're like, dude, come on, you can get conditioned, for, the off season, it'd be really great. So he talks about how he wasn't necessarily the best wrestler. He was not the best, technical wrestler, but he talks about how he worked his ass off. And, he was proud of what he did and how he just tried to intimidate, the other, his opponents and whatnot. And kind of how that sparked a fire saying, I'm kind of good at this wrestling. I really enjoy it and whatnot. And then he kind of delves into how he grew up, kind of watching wrestling and whatnot. And kind of how his dad, wasn't the biggest wrestling fan. But over time, as Mick was watching it, his dad would, kind of watch with him and whatnot. And they'd both get enjoyment out of it. And that was kind of the younger years. And that kind of leads up to college. And when Mick is in college, he hears that Jimmy Superfly Snuka is going to be wrestling, I believe it was Don Morocco, Madison Square Garden in the infamous steel cage match. Yes, if you are a wrestling fan, I'm sure you've probably heard of this infamous match, where I feel like at this point, 10 or 15, people that are wrestling now or have been wrestlers were there to see this infamous moment. And Foley talks about how it was a pivotal moment for him because, he tried to stay out of the light spoilers here, but, he hitchhiked to New York to see this match. He hawked a ticket from a ticket scalper and whatnot. He paid a ridiculous amount, but he talks about how it was such a pivotal moment for him because if you really think about it, he even touches on this. By today's standards, it was not the most holy crap kind of thing, but back then it was so unique, and it was a defining moment for Mick Foley. And I kind of know how he feels, because I think at some point in our lives, we all kind of have that moment where we're like, you know what? I love this. This is, this moment has caused us to love it. Whether it's your team winning the World Series, the Super Bowl, the Stanley Cup championship, whether it's, Mick Foley getting thrown off a Hell in a Cell by The Undertaker. I mean, I think everybody can relate to that part, and the moment of realization of, holy crap, this is what I want to do. I love this. I want to recreate this feeling. Sorry. But anyways, and so we get into how he kind of starts to think about doing wrestling and whatnot, and then he meets a promoter who was having a wrestling show at the local high school and whatnot that his dad worked at, and kind of how he got involved in that, which leads us into kind of his indie scene, because he started, setting up and taking down the ring, and he talked about how he would, get trained a little bit, and how he would drive, and he would drive 400 miles one way to get a wrestling, class for a few hours, and then drive 400 miles back. And so there's a good chunk of this book that, like I said, the first 150, almost 200 pages talks about, how he would do this and whatnot before eventually, graduating college and kind of saying, you know what, this is what I want to do. I want to be a wrestler. And so he would go eventually to kind of do like the indie scene. He talks about how he would go to Africa, overseas in Europe, Asia, South America, and whatnot. And just kind of, breaking into the business and whatnot. And I think this book does a great job of kind of having an insight of what life is like on the road. Obviously, if you're a wrestling fan, you think of the glitz and the glamour and the private jets and, the Ric Flair style of traveling for being a wrestler. But that's not the case for probably 99.9% of wrestlers. I mean, it's really not. Mick does a great job talking about paying his dues, and how things would happen, and he just kept telling himself, hey, you know what, I'm paying my dues, eventually things will work out. And so again, he talks about, his indie life as an indie wrestler and whatnot, and then he kind of leads into his WCW days. I do apologize if I'm not touching a whole lot on, his indie days. Again, it was a decent amount, but not a whole lot to kind of get into. He would go to WCW, where he would, be Cactus Jack and get, famous, his first run around for Cactus Jack and whatnot. And so he was there for about a year or so, and he would, talk about that and touch on that a little bit. And then he talked about how he went to, they weren't using him a whole lot, so he went back doing indie wrestling and building a name for himself and whatnot. And then after a few years of doing that, he would go overseas and wrestle Terry Funk. He would wrestle quite a few guys in like death matches and C4 explosive matches, and whatnot, in front of the masses over there at like not the Tokyo Dome, but like a arena over there and whatnot. And then he would eventually go back to WCW to fight against Sting. Yes, that Sting, the man who just retired a few months back from wrestling at the age of 60 or 70 something. So he would talk about, his run there, and how, he built up trust between him and Sting and whatnot, and how Sting, Sting was seen as a babyface, clean cut, never did anything super crazy and whatnot in his wrestling matches, and they kind of got stale and boring. And then along comes Cactus Jack, who, just told Sting, hey, you know what, let's try this. If you don't like this in this match, never have to do it again. And he talks about how him and Sting got the biggest pop or applause for what they were doing that, him or Sting had heard thus far in their career, at least for a while. And so he kind of got Sting over by showing, hey, you know what, Sting, while he is, a babyface, he's clean cut, he's not really the typical guy you expect to be kind of doing this stuff. You know what, he's willing to go that route to get the job done and whatnot, and to, defend his title and wrestle and whatnot. So he touches on that, and then he ends up going to EC fucking W. Again, I do apologize for cussing. I can't say ECW and not cuss, sorry. But again, he talks about how he goes there and all the different wrestlers that, he would get to know there. Mikey Whipwreck, Tommy Dreamer, the Sandman, Raven, and whatnot. And how, all that, Shane Douglas, just all this crazy stuff. Paul Heyman, to name a few, and whatnot. And how the infamous part where he ended up spitting on the WCW title and whatnot, or tag team titles and whatnot, the belts. and whatnot. And so he would just be there for a while before eventually coming to WWE. He talks about how when he went to the WWE, he spent quite a few years building a name for himself and whatnot. He left ECW, went back overseas, was making decent money, but he knew that the wear and tear he was doing on his body would eventually catch up to him, and then he would go to WWE or WWF, if you will. And so he talks about, the creation of Mankind and how that character kind of came about, and kind of how he, I don't want to say defied Vince McMahon. He told Vince, hey, this character, you want to call him the Mutilator, you want to call him something, you want to do this, you want to do that. He goes, I can't do that. I think this will work. And they went along with it, and thank God they did, because in all honesty, with a name like the Mutilator, I'm not sure he would have gotten over very well. But he gets brought in to go against the Undertaker. Like Sting, he hadn't had any great matches as of the last year or so, and so they bring him in, and so he kind of quickly goes through that a little bit until we get to the part where it's talking about how he's facing The Rock for the championship, for the WWF championship, and how he music hits, Stone Cold comes down, hits the stunner, rolls him over. 1, 2, 3, he wins the championship. And that's kind of where, the book ends off. Originally, this being a later publication of the book, we do get a bonus chapter. We get the chapter of Mick Foley going against, what was it? Oh, Mick Foley going against, in the Fatal 4-Way match and whatnot to revive his career. It touched on that a little bit. Mostly, though, it touches on his fight against Triple H in the Hell in a Cell. Doesn't really touch on that a whole lot. Talks a little bit about, the street fight that he had with Triple H and whatnot. But that's kind of just an extra bonus chapter thrown in there. So I don't really count that a whole lot part of this book. Again, we end off with the glorious moment of Mankind, a.k.a. Cactus Jack, a.k.a. Mick Foley, winning the championship. I know I didn't touch a whole lot on, quite a bit of this book. I mean, it is a chunker of a book. It's 700-something pages long. My thoughts on this after kind of going over that in-depth part of the story, is this is a great book. I'll be honest with you, the first 150-some pages, I was like, okay, you know what? Let's get to the wrestling. But I do see what he was doing. He was kind of setting us up to see, kind of how he came in, to wrestling, and how, what drove him to get there. And so I did enjoy that. When it got to the part talking about him actually wrestling, I did enjoy that. Like I said, I think this book does a great job of actually making people realize how wrestling is. It's not the glitz and the glamour. It's not the limousine ride and jet flying, wheeling dealing, Ric Flair kind of wrestling. I mean, he really did pay his dues. He talks about how he didn't hardly spend any money. He saved every penny he could. I mean, he just did everything that he could to try to, make a better life for him and his family and whatnot. And the more I read this book, the more I really enjoyed it. I couldn't put it down. I mean, there's been a couple times where I was reading this that I was up till midnight, after midnight reading it. I mean, it was just that good, sitting there with my phone trying to hold the page because my nightlight would die. Again, I really enjoyed this book. I know a couple people have said that I flew through it, and I did fly through this book barely over a week, and I finished it. But again, that just goes to show how great of a storyteller Mick Foley is. I know there is a follow-up book to this, and I do plan on getting it hopefully quickly so I can try to read that. I know it's nowhere near as long as this. I think it's like around 400 pages. So it'll be a decent amount less than the 700 chunker. But again, I mean, there's pictures thrown in here so we can kind of see. I'd show y'all, but I'm pretty sure this video would get blocked on YouTube. Again, I really enjoyed this book. Mick Foley has always been one of my favorite wrestlers growing up, even though I didn't really get to see him a whole lot. I grew up watching, as a kid, late 90s, very early 2000s wrestling. The mid-2000s is really where I start to remember, wrestling and whatnot. But I love going back and watching Mick Foley, the man who, would end up going and, I'll put that right there. It doesn't fall. The man who would end up going, and sorry, I'm going to put this back here. The man who would end up going and wrestling for the big three major promotions at the time, as far as WCW, ECW, and WWF. I mean, what more can you say about this man? He gave his body his soul, his blood, his sweat, his tears, everything to the business. A business that he loves, and as of today, he does suffer for it. Um, which is very unfortunate that that it took him doing that to kind of memorialize him in this industry of wrestling. But I don't think that's necessarily the case a whole lot, if I'm being honest with you, because he was a great wrestler. I mean, outside of the crazy bumps and injuries that he had and stuff he did, he was a good wrestler. He just realized a way that he could be memorable and make his opponents look great too, even those ones that really weren't that great of wrestlers. I think Mick Foley did a very good job at making everybody he wrestled look the best that they could. Um, I really do think that Mick Foley is up on the Mount Rushmore of wrestling. He's easily in my top 5 favorite wrestlers of all time, especially after reading this book. I have a new appreciation for him. I appreciated him before reading this book, but I appreciate him even more now. Again, just seeing and reading this book and just kind of seeing everything that he's been through and whatnot for the industry and whatnot. But again, I'm trying to just rambling on at this point, so I'm going to sign off with 2 of his famous slogans or catchphrases, and that is bang bang and have a nice day.